In this lesson, we'll continue working with our model within KeyShot, and we're going to start to edit these materials. Before I do that, I do want to make a couple changes to the environment we're working in. Right now, we're just using the startup HDRI light source that comes with KeyShot whenever you start a new scene, and to me that always looks a little flat. So I'm going to make some changes here. I'll just press the space bar to switch on my project settings, and then I'll go over to my environment tab. And right now my background is created by my lighting environment. So we're really seeing kind of the distorted version of this. And if I drag this around, what this is doing is actually rotating my HDRI around. And you'll notice how my shadows and my lighting is changing as I move this around. So the hotkey for that, if I press my K on my keyboard, rotate environment, control left mouse button drag. So instead of dragging this wheel around and not really seeing what's going on until I let go of it, I can hold down my control key and drag my left mouse button. That environment is rotating around and you can really get to see what's going on with the lighting. So, but that does change our background all the time. So in order to be able to control our background, I'm going to click on color, and that's going to switch that to, by default, a white background. I can go in here and I can make that any kind of color I want. But we'll just leave that as white for now. I can also turn off and on ground shadows. And if I want to eventually render this floating on a transparent background, then I would turn off ground shadows for the rendering. Ground shadow just sort of places it on the ground. And if I turn on ground reflections, it's a little hard in this angle, so let's move it up. You can see some reflections going on into the ground. I'm not going to keep that on while we're working, but it is sort of nice to have for some of your renderings. So the startup HDR, which is listed here, as I said, I don't really care for the lighting. It's just a little kind of washed out looking. So I can just throw a new light scene in here. I'll press the M key on my keyboard and go to Environment. Now we're just going to drag a new environment on here, and in a later lesson we'll actually look at how to edit the environments. So I'm going to go under Studio, and I'm just going to choose 3-point, and I'll drag on my 3-point sharp highlight, which is my very first file there. And then I'll just kind of control mouse around a little bit until I get something I kind of like the look of. There we go. I think that's a little more dramatic anyway. So for these models, if you remember, we just dragged over a generic black plastic. So I'm going to lighten that up just a hair. And in order to edit this, I can just double click on it, and I'll click on that tab. Right now it's got a value of 1, so it's very dark. I do want to lighten that up just a little bit. I'll hit 5 and see how that looks. You can see it's just a little bit brighter. If you're ever editing a color, did something like this, and I really don't want this color to be what I started with, I can either cancel to get out of the window and it'll revert my color, or if I do want to keep adjusting the colors, I've just gone a little too crazy and I want to get back to where I started. This swatch here is the starting color for when you open this window. So I can always just click that and get back to where I was. So let's go ahead and we'll make that, let's just make that a 5. And then I'll do the same thing here. I'll double click this. Now I could lock these two materials together. In this case, I'm not going to, but it's certainly easy enough. We'll look at that a little bit later. And then remember, I do have a door with my battery here, so I'm going to double click on that, even though it's a little hard to see, it is there. And I'll make that the same color as well. Again, I could lock all 3 of those together so that they are linked. As I said, we will look at that a little bit later. If my scene's looking a little bit dark, I can press my right arrow button to brighten my scene up, and I can press that a couple times. And that's sort of a big jump in brightness. If I want to do a smaller increment, I can do my up and down arrows. So down arrow turns the lights back down, but in a smaller increment. So I'm going to adjust my antenna here. I want that to be a little bit brighter than the others. So let's make that a 10. Yeah, that's a little too bright. We'll try 8 and see what that looks like. And we'll go back to 5 for that. Now that is a soft material, so it does look a little bit different than the plastic that we're using for the main body housing. And now let's look at the materials here. So if you remember, we have a gloss material for our side cuts. And I can adjust those as well, make that maybe a 3 just so we're a little bit brighter on that. And I could make those any sort of crazy color I want them to be. Click that swatch to get back to where we started. Again, I'll just type in a 3. Now I can add some texture onto these as well if I really wanted to change up how these look. And the way I do that, I'll hit OK on that. So I'm in plastics right now. And I can click on this texture tab, and I can load either a bitmap if I wanted to add, let's say, a camouflage pattern or something like that. But by using my bump maps, I can actually put in what looks like geometry in here. So if I double click on my bump map, let me pause that and move that into place properly. So double click my bump map. Now it loads the bumps. So what I typically want to choose is these ones that are called normals. Those tend to give you much better results. I'm just going to choose these horizontal tubes. I think we can get a nice little result out of those. I'll click open, and it's not going to look a whole different at the moment. Let me turn this down. What you're probably going to find is these are much too large. So there you go. By adding a 0.1 into that, I've added sort of this vertical look. Now there's all sorts of changes I can make, and the first one I'm going to make is to turn these to 90 degrees. And now I've got these horizontal bumps. And again, I can adjust the scale of these. So if I want those larger, or if I go to a 0.05, they're going to be much tighter, much smaller. We go to a 0.075. And the bump height I can adjust here as well. So if I go to, let's say, a 5 on that, you'll notice we get a much more aggressive bump on those surfaces, and that it's updating the texture on all of the surfaces that that material is applied to. And if I wanted to go to a slightly different angle, let's say I want to do a 45 degree on that, I can do that as well. So bump maps are a very nice, very easy way to get some texture that might be kind of hard to model in 3D. Let me go back to properties, and I might lighten that just a little bit more as well. Brighten that up a bit. All right, so I do want to make a couple of changes. I want to change how this button looks, so I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to bring the color down just a little bit on it. Now I am pumping quite a bit of light into this scene, so once we really tweak the lighting, I think this won't look quite as blown out. So I'm going to copy this color because I want to apply it to these 4 buttons. So I'm going to hold down Shift, left mouse click, and that copies my material. And then I'm going to press Shift, Control, and then right mouse button, and that'll apply a copy of the material to these buttons here. So I have a high gloss black across this area here. This is a chrome, and I'm going to throw just a little texture on that chrome. It's just a little too chromy. Most plastics aren't going to be pure chromy like that. So if I double click on it, now I don't want to go to like a 0.1. You can see that loses all of its chromeness immediately. But I can go to like a 0.0001, and that just adds a little blur here. If that's not enough, I'll take a 0 out of there. We can kind of tweak that until we really get the look that we want on that piece. And also, I'm not quite sure about this orange anymore, so let's change the color up on that as well. So I'm going to hit M for my materials, and I'm going to go under my paints, and I'm going to choose metallics. And you can look through these either as the whole group, and there's really quite a lot of them, or they have them broken down into basic metallics. Let me move this window up a little bit. On your screen, you probably won't have this issue. For the recording dimensions we're using here, my vertical height's a little more limited. But let's say I like this color here. I can just drag that out and throw that onto there. And I think that looks pretty good. Let's see if there's another color in here that I like better. Maybe this slightly darker one. I think that went a little too dark. So if this is close, a little brighter than I want, so I can double click on that. For metals, and you can see this is metallic paint, 2 things are making up this color. It's the base color and then the color of the actual little metal flecks that you can kind of see reflecting in here. So if I turn these down just a little bit, maybe I go to an 85, you notice that metal drops quite substantially, and I can always kind of play with either one of these colors until I get that look just where I want it. We've got our textures on the side here. We've got our metallic paint all applied. Remember, you can just hold down Control and left mouse button to kind of drag those lights around. And usually drag it around until you find a sort of a light setting that's giving you a really nice reflection across your part. So I think that looks pretty good. So that concludes our look at editing materials.